We just heard this month, Mr. President, the report from the Office of Legislative Auditor, the Minnesota Rent Help program, or RentHelpMN program, a program that provided $500 million of federal money over 2 years. We heard about the audit before the Legislative Audit Commission. There were 107,000 applications in the RentHelpMN program. Mr. President, the agency itself, out of 107,000 applications, pruned out 4,350 applications because of its suspicion of fraud in that program. Additionally, Mr. President, of those that the agency did pay out, remember they paid out $500 million, $500 million in housing assistance or housing welfare throughout our state. And of those that were paid out, there were 630 overpayments out of those that were paid out, $3.5 million of overpayment. Mr. President, 2/3 of those 630 overpayments were suspected also by the agency of fraud. That's in addition, Mr. President, to the ones that were pruned out by the agency to begin with. And this, Mr. President, is the agency that is going to be handling in this bill $1.065596 billion in spending. And that's a $990 million increase over the current biennium in this budget area, Mr. President. That is what we are seeing in this bill, an 865% increase in spending in this budget area. And if there's a member here, Mr. President, that wonders why we don't have enough money for, say, our human services bill and nursing homes and other areas that were in that bill, or tax cuts that we hope are forthcoming, they don't have to look any further than this bill and the appetite that the majority has for spending in this area for housing welfare. So that is in here. What I'm worried about, Mr. President, is more fraud. Not only do we have in our history in the state of Minnesota the RentHelpMN program, we've got the Feeding Our Future program that had somewhere in the area of $500 million that was supposed to be fed to kids that would have provided over 1,000 meals a day to every kid in poverty in the state. But guess what? Virtually none of it got to the kids. We know at this point for sure 250 million were stolen. Now it's over 300 million, and the number of indictees went from 50 to 60. Money was used for and robbed from the taxpayers of this state and country for the use of the criminals to turn that money into jewelry and homes and cars. Mr. President, they even bought a car from the Hennepin County Sheriff, for crying out loud. Additionally, there was money that went to buy a laundromat to launder the money through there, and they even bought an airplane to be delivered to another country. We can also look back, Mr. President, to the daycare welfare program of a couple years ago. The legislative auditor was involved with that. Somewhere in the area of $100 million in fraud, suitcases of money that were being shipped to other countries. We have the Medicaid fraud that the legislative auditor chronicled very well several years ago. Over 5 months, if I remember correctly, their office then identified $300 million in fraud, and when that was extrapolated to a full year, it was over $1 billion that the people were defrauded there. Our government is rife with fraud, Mr. President. We have a problem, Houston. We have a problem, Minnesota. And in this bill, we are providing more opportunities for the fraudsters to steal from the fine people of Minnesota. Regardless, Mr. President, if we agree or disagree with this approach for helping the housing situation in this state. This is the people's money. It is our fiduciary responsibility as the custodians of that money to make certain that it is spent in the way that the law, which we are forming out here today, intends it to be spent. So, Mr. President, with that, I would like to offer the A6 amendment.
Senator Drazkowski offers the A6 amendment. The Secretary will report the A6 amendment.
Senator Drazkowski moves to amend House File Number 2335 as amended pursuant to Rule 45 as follows. Page 48, after line 30, insert. This is the A6 amendment.
Senator Drazkowski, to your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd ask for a roll call on the amendment, Mr. President.
Roll call requested, roll call granted. Senator Drazkowski.
And the amendment, thank you, Mr. President, is very short. I'll read it to members. Anyone indicted or charged with fraud related to the RentHelpMN program or Feeding Our Futures is not eligible for any funding under this bill. So what this does is it puts the onus on the agency that has now experienced a major program that they have administered to send money out to people in Minnesota, so they have that experience. And as I mentioned in my opening around the amendment, Mr. President, they already set aside 4,350 applications that they, as an agency that was in a position to hand the money out, knew was highly likely to be fraudulent. So that's what this amendment does, and I have an amendment to the amendment, Mr. President, to make the amendment even better. That is the A20 amendment, Mr. President.
Senator Drazkowski offers the A20 amendment, which is an amendment to the amendment. The Secretary will report the A20 amendment to the amendment.
Senator Drazkowski moves to amend the A6 amendment to House File Number 2335 as follows. Page 1, line 6, after fraud, insert. This is the A20 amendment to the amendment.
Senator Drazkowski, to your A20 amendment to the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would ask for a roll call on the A20 as well, if I could.
A roll call requested and a roll call granted. Senator Drazkowski.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members, this simply inserts or suspected of committing fraud. As I was reading, members, the legislative auditor's report, those 4,350 applicants that the agency itself had high suspicion of fraud, they set them aside. They did not allow those applications in the RentHelpMN program. They set them aside. They know who those people that applied are, and what this amendment to the amendment would do is also make certain that those individuals would not be allowed to take part in this $1.065 billion that goes out to people throughout Minnesota in the form of 28 or 30 different grant and loan programs in the bill. So that's the amendment to the amendment, Mr. President. I encourage member support. Thank you.